Hi everyone, my name is Steffi. I'm a PhD candidate with Innovation North, and I'm so very delighted to host today's speaker series session about systems thinking for social change with Peter Stroh. Innovation North, as you may know, is a community of researchers that seeks to solve organizational and ecosystems challenges. We partner with businesses, nonprofits, and governments to co-create novel solutions to complex challenges. We're based at Abbey Business School at the University of Western Ontario, which is located on the traditional territories of the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, the Lenape, and the Chunongtung nations. Our Innovation North speaker series invites experts, both academics and practitioners, and today, academic and practitioner, to share their experience and perspectives on topics related to systems innovation. We are very, very, very excited, and we just talked about this internally, to have Peter Stroh with us. We love how his work combines the deep insights of systems thinking with practical knowledge, and today he's going to be speaking to us about that. David is an internationally recognized consultant and author who has spent several decades working with foundations, NGOs, governments, and businesses to tackle some of the most pressing challenges of today's, sadly, more pressing today challenges for systems thinking. He's a founding partner of Bridgeway Partners, founding director of Applied System Thinking, and one of the founders of Innovation Associates. He's also the author of the book Systems Thinking for Social Change, after which we've titled today's session. His book was one of the first books I read about systems thinking, and till today it's one of my favorites because it really combines these so abstract concepts sometimes of systems thinking with these practical ways of applying them. So if you haven't read it yet, I would really recommend you go and read it. Now, before we get started with today's session, just a bit of housekeeping. If you have any questions, please put them in the chat. Put them in the chat as we go through the presentation so we have some time to sort through them. And then we will have a 10 minutes Q&A at the end. And with this, without any further ado, David, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Stephanie. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you all for being on the call with me. Um, it seemed like a lot that we are trying to digest in the next 45 minutes or so. So I want to give you a sense of where we're headed and also to point out that there is a lot to cover here, and the book will really help those of you whose interest is piqued by what we talk about this afternoon. So one of the goals, I'd like you to begin to think about why our good intentions to change systems are not enough. All of us are here because we have those good intentions, and yet we often find ourselves very frustrated by what we're actually able to accomplish. To distinguish systems from conventional thinking, because most of our training is actually in what we would call conventional or linear thinking, it just doesn't work well for the kinds of complex social systems that we're trying to influence. Going to spend quite a bit of time reviewing a case study about ending homelessness, and then from that, draw some key lessons for leading systems change. I want to introduce, and it really will be a very quick introduction to 5 different simple systems thinking tools, again, that you can go into in greater depth in the book. And finally, to introduce a 4-stage process for putting all of this together and leading systems change. So to get started, I want you to take a look at the photos here cover food insecurity, criminal justice system, drugs, homelessness, and if you look more into stories behind those headlines, what we discover, and it's all based on true experience, homeless shelters perpetuate homelessness. Food aid leads to increased starvation. Drug busts increase drug-related crime. get tough prison sentences fail to reduce the fear of violent crime. Job training programs increase unemployment. Now, you might ask yourself at this point, what is going on here? What do these stories have in common? And I'd like you to just take a minute or so where you are. You may want to jot down some notes or just think about, what do all of these stories have in common? There's certainly stories of well-intentioned people doing what seems to be the right thing, and yet it's not working. So here are some things that other folks have come up with over the years, and you can kind of compare notes. Failed solutions have common characteristics. They tend to address symptoms instead of underlying problems. What is causing homelessness? What is causing such heavy drug crime and drug use? They actually usually work in the short run. If you put up shelters in the short run, you have fewer people on the streets. If you get tough with prison sentences or provide food aid, initially those problem symptoms go away. However, the short-term gains of those policies are undermined by longer-term impacts that tend to neutralize or make the problems worse. Neutralize the gains or make the problems worse. For most people, those negative consequences are unintentional. And then here is perhaps the most challenging. If the problem recurs, we do not see our responsibility for the problem. After all, we have the best of intentions. We're all about solutions. Yet we don't see how our actions, our thinking, our intentions have contributed to the very problems we're trying to solve. This was a great summary of our challenge. When you're confronted by any complex social system with things about it that you're dissatisfied with and anxious to fix, you cannot just step in and set about fixing with much hope of helping. This is one of the sore discouragements of our time. And the person who wrote that, Lewis Thomas, was a medical doctor and essayist, president of the Memorial Sloan Kettering Institute, dean of Yale Medical School, dean of New York University School of Medicine, a very accomplished person with a lot of insight and appropriate humility. Now, what he goes on to say is if you want to fix something, you're first obliged to understand the whole system. And I want to assure you that you will never understand the whole system. Nobody will. It's way too complex. However, we can gain insights into how that system operates in such a way as to gain more leverage and accomplish the kinds of results we're looking for over time. In order to do that, we need to distinguish systems from conventional thinking. So just briefly, some definitions. Donella Meadows, who is a world-famous systems thinker, described a system as an interconnected set of elements that is coherently organized in a way that achieves something. And you kind of go look at that last word, something. That is like a very key word here. What is the system designed to accomplish? Because there's a principle that systems are perfectly designed to achieve what they're achieving right now. So if they're not achieving what we want them to achieve, then what are they designed to achieve? And that's a critical question. Systems thinking, by contrast, I would say is the ability to understand these interconnections in such a way as to achieve a desired purpose. Now, what do we mean by systems thinking? First of all, it helps to contrast it with conventional thinking, which is the kind of thinking we were exposed to in most of our education. Basically saying there's simple linear cause and effect. If I have a problem, like cut my hand, I put a Band-Aid on it, I'm done. Simple problem, simple solution. In conventional thinking, problems and their underlying causes have obvious connections. But in systems thinking, those problems and their underlying causes are not obviously connected. In conventional thinking, if things don't work, it's because we're doing the best we can and others are to blame for why things aren't working the way they should. In systems thinking, we actually start with the premise that somehow we're part of the problem as well as the solution. And we don't do that to turn the finger on ourselves and blame ourselves. We actually do it to empower ourselves, to recognize that the greatest control that we have over a system is through our own intentions, our own thinking, and our own behavior. In conventional thinking, if something works in the short term, it will also work in the long term. Thinking systemically, we recognize that most quick fixes make no difference in the long term or can actually make matters worse. If we're trying to improve a system, conventionally, the idea is we optimize each of the parts. We set goals for the sales department. We set goals for the R&D department. We set goals for each of these parts of an organization separately, and then assume that if each of those are working to the best of their ability, then the system will perform better. But in systems thinking, the insight is that if you want to improve the performance of a system, you improve the relationships among the parts of the system, not each of the parts individually. And finally, it seems always like there's so many things to do. What do we do? What actions do we take? And usually the assumption when we're overwhelmed is to try to do as much as we can as quickly as we can. When in fact, systems pivot around leverage points, focusing on a few key coordinated actions taken over time. So that's a lot of words. We can summarize it perhaps with a few visuals. This is sort of the quintessential systems cartoon. And I'm going to try to do something here. Enter options. There we go. No, not that one. This one. Okay. So here we have the expert problem solver. They're paid to solve problems and they're part of the organization or system. They figure out a solution that works for their part of the system, but they don't see which way this person is facing, away from the ripple effects of their actions. And over time, those ripple effects can impact many other stakeholders and take quite a bit of time before that final domino falls. And when that final domino falls, there are two possibilities. The first one is this guy is still in the chair, at which point he gets hit over the head, and who's he going to blame for getting hit over the head? Naturally, it's the domino off here to his right. I was doing fine. Look what I accomplished. And then some other idiot somewhere else in the system is making my life miserable. There's another alternative. Because of the time delays involved in these ripple effects, that person is no longer in the chair. And more often than not, where they are is promoted. And they're promoted because they're so good at problem solving in the short term. And there's this one. I'm sure glad the hole isn't in our end. Even though we might be high and dry, it's usually temporary because we're actually all in the same boat. And the faster we realize that and can work to redesign the boat collectively, the more effective we're going to be. So, a story about ending homelessness. Many years ago, I was asked by the group in Calhoun County, Michigan, population of about 100,000, centered around Battle Creek, Michigan, which is where Kellogg and Kellogg Foundation are based. And they had a question, and notice the question is very important here. The question they had was, why, despite our best efforts, have we been unable to end homelessness in Calhoun County? Some facts, they had about 14 to 1,600 people homeless in a population of 100,000. They had a homeless coalition that had been meeting for 10 years, and that included providers of services, consumers of the services, or homeless people, funders, city and county reps. But they had failed to deal with the problem because of disagreements, of competition, lack of knowledge. And they finally had an opportunity to receive funding to develop a 10-year plan to end homelessness. There was motivation to work together to end homelessness. My colleague and I had been working with the Kellogg Foundation, and they had been introduced to systems thinking, and they asked us to integrate systems thinking with a community building process. So you may be familiar with the idea of getting the whole system in the room, getting all the different stakeholders to gather and talk with each other. And what we did is we added and structured into those conversations an understanding of how the system was currently working and some of the non-obvious interdependencies among the different stakeholders in the room. Now, these were some of the stakeholders on the left. There were elected officials, business leaders, homeless shelter director, etc. In the center was their espoused purpose, what they said they wanted to accomplish, which were variations on, we want to end homelessness. But you'll also see here on the right-hand column, each of them had other priorities designed, not surprisingly, to optimize their part of this more complex system. So if we take a few examples, elected officials on the one hand were saying, look, permanent housing, support services, and jobs are important, but to themselves, they were kind of thinking, look, it takes a long time, that's expensive, and the community has other more immediate issues. The homeless shelter directors, these are the folks in charge of putting a roof over these folks' heads and giving them food. Giving people shelter is humane. The other priority, however, how do you get funded as a homeless shelter? The more beds we fill, the more money we get. Now, how you get from how you get from full shelter beds to ending homelessness That's a little bit hard to connect. If you're a funder, on the one hand, you're saying we are committed to helping homeless people, which they are. And on the other hand, our board wants to show results now. So there are these pulls in the system between what I would call the espoused purpose and the purpose in practice, the purpose in use, or the benefits of the system to the different stakeholders. Now, if you looked at some of the key variables in the system over time, you would noted they would have seen that the estimated number of homeless people was gradually increasing, albeit with temporary improvements. The visibility of the problem had also oscillated, but was kind of stable. And the efforts to reduce homelessness had actually plateaued. So how do we explain these patterns and ultimately try to shift some of those patterns going forward? Well, in order to do that, we need to understand something that we call system structure. And I'll call this the story of the irony of temporary shelters. So in this case, with homeless people, the quick fix that was largely supported by the community and managed by the emergency providers and shelter directors was to provide temporary shelters and supports. And you can look at this dashed line as sort of a change in the opposite direction. As temporary shelters go up, the homeless population in the short run goes down. And isn't that what we want? Think back to the headline. However, people were also beginning to recognize that there was a more fundamental solution to homelessness. In the US, it was called housing first, and it was included permanent housing for people, permanent affordable housing, the provision of critical services to the homeless people who needed them in those places where the housing was, and of course, employment for people who are capable of working. But notice the time delays here. It takes longer to correct the problem by implementing the fundamental solution than it does by implementing the quick fix. So what was happening is as the homeless population went up, there was more pressure to build shelters and fill beds, which reduced the number of homeless people, which actually reduced the motivation to implement the more fundamental solution. I mean, if we're able to put a Band-Aid on this and the bleeding stops, why do more? Well, there's some good reasons to do more because dependence on those temporary shelters and supports reduced the visibility of the problem, which reduced pressure in the community to make more fundamental shifts in how homelessness was treated, which further undermined the ability of the community and the incentives to implement the fundamental solution, which would increase the homeless population over time, require more shelters, and reduce the visibility of the problem and reduce the pressure. And that is a vicious cycle over time. In addition, if you're a homeless shelter and you're doing your job of filling beds, then you get funding. Well, that kind of works well. If you get funding, you're busy filling beds and managing the people who come through your shelters. That reduces your willingness, the time you have, and the funding you have to innovate and collaborate, which is what would be required to implement the fundamental solution, which then further increases the homeless population over time, increases the dependence on shelters, increases the funding to those organizations, reduces their willingness, and we have another vicious cycle over time. And then finally, those well-intentioned funders are under pressure for short-term results. So they feed the funding to the shelters because they're saying, well, look, we're helping fill beds. We're doing the right thing. Of course, we'll provide more funding to do that. And those are the dynamics that we exposed, uncovered for this multi-stakeholder coalition. Now, underneath that were some beliefs and assumptions that actually perpetuated some of the dynamics, and we call these mental models. Now, you can actually show the mental models on this diagram, and it's the mental models, the beliefs and assumptions that keep the dynamics in place. So the service providers are saying, look, we have to help people now. It's the humane thing to do. So that's why they put the emphasis on temporary shelters. The public officials, meanwhile, are saying, look, it might be best practice to do this housing first stuff, but it's too hard, takes too long, it's too expensive, so we're not going to throw our political weight behind implementing that fundamental solution. The public is saying, because the visibility of the problem is being maintained, it's not going up, what's the problem? We have more pressing needs in the community. Squeaky wheel gets the grease. Meanwhile, the service providers again are looking at the funding they're getting and saying, look, we have to protect our own funding. We have caring employees. They're really helping the homeless people. We've got to protect what we have. And finally, the donors are saying, our board expects results. So with those types of underlying beliefs and assumptions, no wonder that these dynamics persisted. And then if we go one level deeper here and take a look at this curious idea of a system's purpose, what is the purpose of that system? People will always often say, I'm in a dysfunctional system. It doesn't work. We need a better system. Well, oddly enough, that system, this system and other systems are designed to achieve something. So what are the current benefits or purpose of the system? Well, people end up feeling good about helping people cope with homelessness. They reduce the visibility of the problem. They reduce the severity of the problem. After all, people do have a roof over their heads, at least for a number of nights a month, and they do get food while they're there. And oh, by the way, we receive funding for doing what we're doing. Those seem like some pretty good reasons for continuing to do what we're currently doing, even as we say it's not working. But if our espoused purpose is to end homelessness, that is very different than what's going on the left, which is helping people cope with homelessness. Out of that analysis, people identified some high leverage interventions. They were thinking long term now and acting in the short term. One intervention was to actually reduce shelter use and reframe the use of shelters that were in operation as temporary transitional housing, not the permanent solution. A vision of housing first was shared with all of those providers. That was best practice, and this community was learning about it. And as a result of that, there was more of a commitment to invest in affordable housing with support services. So some of the results of this project, first of all, These interventions were the basis of the 10-year plan to end homelessness. So they won funding from the state. There was a breakthrough in the level of collaboration in the community among these different stakeholders. The Homeless Coalition voted unanimously the next time there was housing and urban development funding coming through to shift that funding from one service provider's transitional housing program to permanent supportive housing run by another provider. So they collectively agreed to not keep funding just temporary sheltering, but to actually shift funding in the community to more permanent supportive housing, even though that was being run by another provider. In the plan's first 6 years of operation, which included the economic collapse of 2008, the county reported homelessness decreased by 14%, which you might say is not a lot, but despite a 34% increase in unemployment and a 7% increase in evictions. So if we step back from this story now and try to glean some lessons from it and move to some tools. So leading systems change, lessons, and tools. First of all, it really helps to bring together as wide a diversity of stakeholders as you can, representing the different points of view, the different pulls and tugs in the system. Helping those people distinguish the problem symptoms from the underlying root causes of the problem. Using systems maps, but in a particular way, to answer a why question. For example, why, despite our best efforts, are we unable to end homelessness in our community? Those maps are not designed to map the quote unquote system, because the system is inherently too complex, too overwhelming, and showing all of the different variables and all of the different interdependencies would actually lead to further paralysis, not insight into where the leverage is. Challenge people to see how they are part of the problem, not just part of the solution. Like challenging the service providers, well-intentioned service providers, to see their role in why that problem was perpetuated. Again, not to blame them, but to empower them, to help them see how their own intentions, their own thinking, and their own behavior is undermining what they themselves say they care most about. Where possible, explain the root causes in terms of something we call system archetypes, and I'll show you an example of that in a moment. And then there's try to keep it reasonably simple, your analysis reasonably simple and recognizable without oversimplifying. Help people surface and integrate diverse points of view or diverse mental models about what's going on. And finally, uncover and challenge the trade-offs between the existing and desired purpose. So here are some very simple tools, and this is again going to be a drive-by for you to refer back to. First of all, stakeholder mapping is a really good way of understanding who are the different stakeholders and how you intend to work with them. The iceberg is a model for helping people quickly move from understanding symptoms and talking about symptoms to focusing down to underlying causes. Systems archetypes are a way of refining our insights into how those root causes work together to produce the problems that we experience. Making mental models explicit, remember those thought bubbles on the diagram, are a way of surfacing underlying beliefs and assumptions, which are critical drivers of the dynamics that people are caught in. Think long-term and act short-term. It's not like systems thinking is all about the long-term, forget about the short-term. It's actually both and. Act in the short term, but within the context of a long-term strategy. So this is an example of a stakeholder map. You look at the stakeholders, what their level of support currently is, where you want their support to be, what are their distinctive motivations for change, and based on your insights about their distinctive motivations for change, how can you interact with each of those stakeholders individually? Now, it doesn't mean from there, you would move to work with them collectively and encourage them to work with each other collectively. But you start with an assessment of who they are and what is motivating them and where you want them, how you want them to participate. I'm going to ask you a quick question. You can think about it for a moment. How many of you believe in visionary leadership? And visionary leadership is essentially, in order to be an effective leader, you need to have a vision of a desired future. And I sure hope that most of you are saying, absolutely. Effective leaders need to have a vision of where we're going, an inspiring vision. And I would say, absolutely. Yes, and. And here's the and. I've got it too, Omar, a strange feeling like we've just been going in circles. Now, this is what the leaders are expected to do. They're expected to look out on the horizon and guide us toward the promised horizon. However, these folks are not particularly paying attention to the nature of the structure that they're trying to impact. And that structure is going to take them in circles without their realizing it for quite a while. So not only do they need to be focused on that promised vision, but they also need to have a shared understanding of current reality, of the nature of the structure that they're currently trying to change. In order to do that, there's a tool that we use called the iceberg, which is designed to help people distinguish symptoms from causes. Now, what we know about icebergs is that the most obvious part of the iceberg is above the waterline, and it's just the tip. So we can characterize this as we tend to focus on events, on things that are happening at particular points in time, of crises, fires that we have to fight. And when we look at the world through that lens, the best we can do is to react or firefight. If we step back from individual events, we might notice how they are connected to each other over time. There are some recognizable patterns that are emerging. And if we understand those trends or patterns, we can try to anticipate or forecast how those might go in the future. The only problem is if we're seeing a trend go in the wrong direction, it's not particularly reassuring to know that things are just going to get worse. We obviously want to turn them around. And that requires us to go deeper, to understand the essence of that iceberg, which we call system structure, the forces and pressures at play in the system. And those include the policies and practices, the nature of the relationships, partnerships, power dynamics, the perceptions or mental models that people have, and finally, the actual purpose of the system as it is currently functioning. Thank you. And if we understand things in terms of system structure, now we have something we can change or create differently into the future because it's the system structure that influences the trends and patterns, which in turn influence the events into the future. And in order to get at these different levels, we ask different questions. What happened? What's been happening over time? And finally, that focusing question, why? Why does this keep happening? So that's the iceberg. I mentioned this idea of systems archetype. These are classic structures, or what Donella Meadows would call systems traps, that play out in a wide variety of social systems. It helps to understand what they are, because when we understand them, we're less likely to fall into those traps. And if we're in them, it takes some of the sting out of them. It's not like we're to blame. It's a normal tendency, and we need to discern what that tendency is so that we don't fall into that trap. Generically, the way that the homeless example works is that there is a problem symptom, there's a quick fix that temporarily addresses the symptom, but there's a longer term fundamental solution. However, because the quick fix works in the short term, it undermines our motivation to implement the long-term solution. And then over time, the more and more we use the quick fix, it actually produces side effects that make it even harder to implement the long-term solution over time. So we see a pattern of behavior where the problem symptom temporarily improves, but gradually is getting worse and worse. We're spending more and more time on the quick fix, more and more resources on the quick fix, less and less time on the long-term solution, even though we say we know what the long-term solution is. And this is an underlying dynamic of addiction. We literally become addicted to the quick fix. It doesn't need to be a substance. It can be a policy. We can become addicted to tough prison sentences. We can be addicted to food aid. We can be addicted to to drug busts or homeless shelters. Those in this way of thinking about things are actually addictions because we're not getting at the underlying causes or the more fundamental solutions. And here's the nature of the challenge. Damned if you do, damned if you don't. If you just focus on the quick fix, on surviving, you undermine your ability to thrive. But very often, if you only focus on what it takes to thrive, the fundamental solution, you don't get the necessary support and investment to deal with that fundamental solution. And the quick fix, if you don't implement the quick fix, things will perhaps get totally out of hand. Talked about surfacing mental models, and these were the mental models in the homelessness case. This is sort of a more generic version of this challenge, helping people see more of the elephant, which is a Sufi story from about 1,000 years ago. So we have one blind person touching the elephant's leg, saying it's a tree trunk, another touching the trunk, saying it's a snake, the other one touching the hair, saying it's a brush, another one touching the tail, saying it's a rope. And then, of course, many of us experience this part of the elephant. But none of the stakeholders are seeing the whole elephant. And one way you can approach this systems mapping And that even relatively high level of insight is to help everybody in the system get a better picture of what they're actually dealing with. That boat that they're trying to navigate through the water and change its direction over time. And then finally, in the book in chapter 9 is a cost benefit matrix, and there's a generic version of this, talking about thinking long term and acting short term. There is always a case for change, and that's, of course, the vision, the benefits of change. But also, if we don't do anything, how is it going to get worse? The costs of not changing. On the flip side, there's the case for the status quo. What are the payoffs to the status quo, as we saw in the homelessness case? And what are the costs of changing? So what we need to help people do is, first of all, make the case for change and the case for the status quo explicit, not implicit. Help people think long term, I'm sorry, by showing how the payoffs of the status quo, what people are accomplishing in the short term, actually undermines their ability to achieve what they say they want in the long term. And then act short term. Usually those short-term actions are around building capacity, building new relationships, capacities and systems thinking and productive conversations. They're about investment. And we know that investments take time to pay off. Very quickly in closing, the book describes a four-stage process for applying these insights and these tools. It starts with building a foundation for change with the diverse stakeholders, getting an initial identification from them of what we say we want and where we are, the goal being to increase the readiness for change in the system. From there, to drill down further into current reality, to both develop shared understanding and, very importantly, shared acceptance of current reality, because that current reality includes helping people see how they're part of the problem, not just part of the solution. And with those insights, they're now capable of making an explicit choice, a commitment to what they say they want, recognizing some of the trade-offs that may be involved to get there. And then finally, with that commitment, they're able to think about bridging the gap between the reality and the aspiration, identifying leverage points, sustaining momentum, making corrections over time. And very briefly, for those of you who are interested in learning more, my book is, as Stephanie said, called Systems Thinking for Social Change, and you can get it in a lot of different places. You can look at my website. The Systems Thinker is a collection of articles from a newsletter that went for about 20 years, and it has wonderful systems thinking stories in it. It's only 12 pages per newsletter, lots of different articles, and those, thankfully, have been archived on the web. And finally, you can email me here. So with that, Stephanie, by my estimate, I think we're at 10 minutes to go.